In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Who is Saint Isidore of Seville. Not many people, I don't know many people are familiar with him. He's not a very popular saint that I know of. But one of those tremendously important figures in the history of the world, not just the church. I mean, I don't know if I would say primarily in the church. I would almost say primarily in the world, and especially for Europe, kind of one of the pillars of Europe and what we have today as the Western civilization. People take it for granted that I think the average, brainless, a citizen who thinks they're well informed absolutely are not. They have no idea what happened in the Middle Ages. They'll know something about like the Roman Empire, Alexander the Great, etc. And after that, what? Oh, I don't know. If they're educated, Isaac Newton, the Protestant Revolution, etc. Nothing in between. This is the stuff that happened in between that built everything we have today, and we're going to find out about that. So St. Isidore of Seville, last of the Western Church Fathers, born in the year 560, died in the year 636. Not too many details are known of his personal life, but he was born to noble parents in southern Spain, and he had two older brothers, both of whom were bishops of important cities. His older brother, Leander, was Bishop of Seville, and Isidore's parents died when he was young, so Leander, his older brother, took him in and raised him, and eventually would pass on the bishopric to his younger brother. Isidore received an excellent education in Seville in the Trivium and the Quadrivium, which was, and it was the last surviving school of what had once been a flourishing Roman culture. For at this time, the late 500s, the Roman Empire was collapsing, or what the remnants of it were in the midst of collapsing. The barbarian invasion was continuing. The Ostrogoths were moving in. And that structure, that culture that the Romans had built was disintegrating, and very few things were left of it. So Isidore of Seville received an education like the last tail end of it, and he knew what was happening, and he was able to use that education and continue it, as we'll see. But he was brilliant in his studies, and he had a love of learning of every kind, and mastered every subject, including the languages of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And although he never became a monk, he had an attraction to the monastic way of life, of contemplation and prayer and learning and a disciplined daily routine. So this twofold love of learning and love of God he would use, and the education he'd gotten, this would help him to create a system of study and a body of knowledge that would last for the next 1,000 years. So he would become, as I mentioned, so the Roman Empire is collapsing, the Goths are moving in, and it isn't just that Roman culture is collapsing and a barbarian culture is kind of rising. The Goths were not Christians, they were not Catholics. They were Arians, Arian heretics, believing a heresy about Christ the Son. So this was threatening, and Spain was not. We shouldn't think of it as like a unified country or culture. It was been a Roman territory, and many different peoples were united under the Roman system. And when that Roman system was gone, what did the people have? They didn't have an identity. It wasn't like, oh yeah, we're all Spaniards. They didn't exist. So there was kind of two possibilities facing Isidore after he became Bishop of Seville, and one of the most important cities, one of the most important positions, and he's almost serving as a second ruler. So you have got the Visigoth king, who is Arian, and those Visigoths hold the temporal power, and Isidore is trying to maintain the purity of the Catholic faith. How is he going to keep the Catholic religion from being polluted by Arian heresy? So he's got the collapsing Roman Empire, facing a barbarian culture, keeping the Catholic culture together, which is not that old. It's only been a couple hundred years since the Council of Nicaea, and Christianity has no longer been persecuted but permitted. So its times are very volatile, very uncertain, and in addition to all the usual pressures, you would say, of a bishop of a large territory, he's trying to keep. He doesn't even know. I mean, what is he trying to preserve? I mean, he's trying to preserve knowledge, but you can't preserve the Roman Empire. What's going to happen? He ended up being the forge of a new nation, is forging a cultural identity for Spain in the midst of this. It was either allow it to be overrun by barbarians or try to give the people something they can hang on to. And he did it by preserving the Catholic faith and passing on the Roman knowledge of all the subjects that the Romans had Quadrivium, Trivium, etc. Now, the way he did this was by establishing seminaries in every diocese of his territory. And in the seminaries, he was able to ensure, and it wasn't like this. The seminaries didn't exist in Spain. It was, if you were going to be a priest, you were taken in by the local parish priest or the local bishop. They taught you what they knew, and then you just took over after them. That's what had happened with Saint Isidore. He was taken in by his brother. He was given an excellent education, and then he flourished. But see, he knew not everybody has access to what I had access to. Not everybody's going to be taken in by a Bishop Leander and given this phenomenal education. Not everybody has that. But he knew that was what was necessary. So he did that. He compiled kind of a distilled version of what he had gotten, and he made that available in dioceses all over Spain, what would become Spain. And so he was able to pass on not just the purity of the Catholic faith and religious studies, but he taught humanities, he taught the arts, he taught languages and drama and history. They didn't call it history, they called it chronology. So this is what Isidore of Seville did, and he knew, he knew that when a culture is falling apart and things are collapsing and there's much ignorance and much barbarism, that knowledge is power. In that state of affairs, those who have knowledge are going to have more ability and power once the administrative state has collapsed. And so to those men, those priests, who were going to be forming souls, he was forming them. He was forming the priests who were going to form the people, and the people were going to grow and end up becoming just the next generation. So that he had the vision to foresee several generations in advance, and sure enough, that is what happened. The formation he gave through those seminaries to the priests gave it to the people, and that ended up becoming the culture now that we know as the roots of Spain. And one of the things, in addition to all this, he was able to compile an encyclopedia, which it seems nothing to us, but at this time in church history, the 6th, 7th century, encyclopedias didn't exist. There was one encyclopedia that was a monumental task undertaken by Pliny the Elder, the Roman historian in 1st century A.D. But since his efforts, nothing had been done, especially not for the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had so many more things that were of importance than the Romans had thought, like grace and sin and salvation and knowledge of Christ and all these things about the church that didn't exist in the Roman Encyclopedia. What were they? What were the essences of things? So Isidore put together his encyclopedia, and he preserved not only all that Roman knowledge, but introduced a knowledge of from the church as well. So certainly a tremendous accomplishment, and that encyclopedia of his lasted from the 600s all the way into the 1500s. So nearly 1,000 years, the body of knowledge he put together was being taught in schools and seminaries and universities and so on. Also, let's see, about 600 years before Thomas Aquinas, Isidore introduced Aristotle to the West. When Aristotle was introduced into the rest of the church by Thomas Aquinas. It wasn't news in Spain. I think that's where Thomas Aquinas would have got it from the first place. It was Aristotle being taught in Spain because of Isidore of Seville, well ahead of his time. There's also, this is the kind of thing that people are just take for granted, is they don't understand that certain things in life that we think are so basic were actually accomplishments, especially in regards to written communication. Like some people take for example, they take for granted the period, like ending a sentence or a comma. That was not standard. St. Isidore of Seville standardized the use of the period and the comma and the colon. Imagine not having those and trying to write a sentence and people not knowing, like, where did you stop, right? So this is the kind of stuff that again, people take for granted. How do you invent the period or the comma? Anyways, so Isidore standardized it. He didn't invent it, but he standardized it and made it universal across written communications. So Isidore was able to unite Spain around its identity as a center of culture and learning, while the rest of Europe was being overrun with barbarians and everybody was losing the Roman culture, the Roman education. Isidore preserved it and in fact gave other countries in Europe an idea of this is how to preserve ourselves and even fuse together this new barbarian culture with a rising Catholic faith and how to preserve that faith in the midst of heresy. Isidore of Seville was paving the way for other countries. Now you can't do this though without an intensive prayer life. These accomplishments of Saint Isidore, he was able to do that because he had a strong interior life, as I mentioned earlier, that life of prayer and meditation, like almost monastic life. And he would say this, and it was manifested in his love of neighbor. In fact, what he did this for was not so much for the love of learning itself, but for what learning and education did for the person. Even as Saint Augustine would say, he wouldn't have been able to convert to the faith if he hadn't received an education first. It was his education in Plato that gave him the basis to be able to convert. And Isidore knew that. And so he said, just as we must love God in contemplation, so we must love our neighbor with action. It is impossible to live without the presence of both the one and the other form of life. So that contemplative life of God and the active life of service to our neighbor, right? He was that's like almost the Benedictine model, ora et labora, work and prayer, active life, contemplative life. In the last months of his life, St. Isidore felt his death approaching and began more and more to divest himself of the goods of this world. When poor persons would come to his door, he would give them increasingly great alms and even his own personal effects. Isidore of Seville finally died on April 4th in the year 636. The Bishop of Saragossa, at his death, said that he was the man of God that God had raised up to save the Spanish people from the tidal wave of barbarism. At the 8th Council of Toledo, 20 years after his death, he was proclaimed the extraordinary doctor, the latest ornament of the Catholic Church, the most learned man of the latter ages, and always to be named with reverence. So thus, the legacy immediately after his death, only a few short decades after his death, he's already being recognized for his accomplishment, as I said, which would last over 1,000 years in the church. So I can't help but see a parallel between the state of Spain at his time and the state of our own kind of current world. The current world cannot continue in its current state. We are in a very great time. It doesn't seem like it because all the institutions are currently still in place, but we're in a great time of coming instability. Either the Catholic Church is going to return to her flourishing, or we are going to descend even worse into totalitarianism and so on. So I do foresee the necessity of a man of God like Isidore to preserve, just what the world has. All these things the world's taking for granted, which came from the church. That's going to be lost unless God acts. But we don't have to fear, because who was it that raised up Isidore? it was God, right? It was God who His grace is moving in the world. So we are going to need men like this, able to carry the world and to carry the faith through, and that is our, I would say, task, is not to lose hope, not to be overwhelmed by the tidal wave of modern barbarism, like technological barbarism, or technological oppression, rather, but to have faith, to continue and to know that what God wishes to happen in the world, He will accomplish, right? God will accomplish that, but our cooperation is what He's looking for. He's looking for our cooperation. He's looking for our trust. He's looking for us not to be overwhelmed by that fear, but to place our trust that God is going to continue to act and save souls. So let's continue our prayers, continue our good works, continue our love of learning, I would even say, a love of learning about the church and the saints and the world God has created, and then that love of neighbor, that love which desires to bring to others the truth of the faith, and even the beauty and the freedom of truth itself. Christ Himself said that, I am the way and the truth and the life, and the truth will set you free. Right? That's what the Catholic Church always did. That's what men like St. Isidore did. They wanted to bring people to the truth. They wanted to bring truth to people. So let's pray for that desire and that ability, which we're only going to get through grace, which comes through prayer and fidelity to the church. So may God bless you all in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.